He could buy anything, everything the world could display behind glass. He owned gardens that bent light into private suns and rooms where footsteps sounded like careful decisions. He kept a house so immaculate that laughter felt out of place, as if it might muss a cushion or disturb a polished surface. On a bright morning, a lone wheelchair sat by the sash of the gardener's arbor, sunlight drawing a small island on the marble. Amanda, 8 years old, quiet as carved stone, watching the world through another kind of window. Richard Lawson understood the arithmetic of loss, the way most people understand numbers. Money subtracted at the end of the ledger felt neat and final. What could not be tallied, sleep given to worry, meals eaten alone, a child's vanished smile, stayed like a weight no bank could lift. Since the accident, since the slow shuttering of his wife's voice from their home, Richard had turned the mansion into an armor. Specialists came and went, their voices polite and technical. Machines hummed with precise sympathy. There had been regimes of physiotherapy and stretches and careful meals, and doctors who used words like pathway, engagement, and rehabilitation. None of it recovered what the word mama used to center and soften in their house. Amanda's laughter had been the axis. Without it, the rooms had settled into a kind of polite mourning. For months, the house held its breath. Staff moved with soft efficiency. The nanny replenished cups and straightened cushions. Portraits of a life that had been felt pinned to the walls like dried flowers, beautiful and sad. Richard went through his days like a man inspecting investments, checking risks, delegating away unpredictability. He loved Amanda with a precision that had the shape of hours and plan. He loved with an insistence that was careful, almost professional. He did not know how to be messy with grief or clumsy with hope. He thought he had tried everything. The garden, though, was the one place where the house's perfection met the unscripted. Beyond the hedge, a wooden gate and a stretch of lawn separated the mansion from a city that kept on living in the way cities do, in alleys and laundromats, and the steady rhythm of those who must make do. On a weekday just after 4, when the light slanted soft and long, and the world seemed to be pausing between tasks, a small figure slipped inward through a gap in the hedge. Bare feet glanced over the grass, muddy soles quick as if they were part of the ground. He wore a thin jacket, too big for his arms, and pants patched at the knee. He had a name, Cola, and the name seemed to suit him the way a nickname suits the fast and the fearless. He did not look like an intruder, so much as like a stray note that had found the beginning of a song. He carried nothing but an appetite for movement and a set of hands that remembered rhythm. He did not announce himself. He let his body speak. In the hush of trimmed hedges and deliberate silence, Cola began to dance. He danced not for the house, not for the guards who had their backs turned, and not for the city that he moved away from with each step. He danced for the child in the wheelchair. His arms flung wide, his feet tapped a quick staccato across the marble path at the garden's edge. He rolled his shoulders. He did an exaggerated bow. He pulled faces like someone in a play only he could see. The rhythm in his chest translated to movement in his limbs. The music was whatever he made of the air. Amanda turned her head. For months, eyes had been careful, like someone touching glass. For the first time in a long time, something uncalculated threaded through her features and loosened them. The motion of Cola's shoulders, the way he made a mock heroic sweep of his hand, sudden, ridiculous, made something inside her respond. A small sound slipped out, a laugh, quick and surprised, like a bird startled into flight. It was not loud, it was not sustained. It was, to Richard, the most expensive sound in the world. He had been on the balcony, watching the stone courtyard the way a man watches a balance sheet. When he heard the laugh, he felt a strange rupture inside him. Anger rose first. How dare anyone trespass on the orderly world he had built? But the sound in his house was not an affront, it was entry. He descended the staircase to the garden like a man waking from a long, stratified sleep. The gardener's hedges shrugged as he passed. The nanny in the doorway watched with a mix of alarm and unexpectedly relief. Kola froze when he saw Richard. For a second, the boy was small as a shadow against the mansion's light. Then he smiled, unembarrassed, as if he had bargained with fate and won a grin. Richard's mouth thinned. "Who are you?" he asked, the question being less one of curiosity and more the style in which he kept control. Kola shrugged. "I'm Kola. I dance." It should have been the end of it. Guards called, explanations given, apologies made. Instead, Amanda turned her face to Richard, and in its folded softness there was a petition he had not known how to read, until that laugh, brief and brittle, broke free. He had everything, and he had nothing. The laugh was an accusation and a hope. His anger surrendered to a different impulse. He wanted to protect this fragile newness. There is a peculiar and dangerous kind of hope, the sort that enters without warning and refuses to be filed away. He found himself speaking, more to Amanda than to the boy. "Let him stay," he heard himself say. The house breathed, as if someone had opened a window after a long, shut winter. The nanny blinked. The gardener straightened his rake. A protocol had been replaced by a human flicker. Kola, who had expected to be chased away, grinned and kept dancing until Amanda's laughter braided with it. He danced until 4, turned toward 6, and then, without fanfare, he left as he had come, bare feet taking him past the gate and back into the city's folds. He promised to be back tomorrow. If this moment speaks to you, if you remember a time when a small act of unexpected kindness cracked a hard place inside you, stay with the story. Remember the sound of a laugh when you listen for it again. What followed looked at first like a small mercy. Kola returned each day at 4. There was a rhythm to it, a rhythm the house had not hosted before. The staff adjusted on cue. Guards were instructed, by Richard's clipped note, to allow the boy through at a certain hour and to usher him away at 6. Practicalities like meals and a blanket and a place to sit were given, not as charity theatre, but as the minimal scaffolding that paired with the essential thing Kola had come to offer, play. Days layered themselves into a sequence of small rituals. Kola would appear at the hedge, marching as if he owned the marble. He would stage comedic skits, challenge Amanda to copy a movement, let her mirror him with tentative fingers. He made faces and invented games, and taught Amanda how to clap in patterns. The clapping came first, hands hitting small arcs of sound, tentative applause that felt like someone learning to walk with their palms. Then came the reaching, Amanda stretching, sometimes with a grimace, for a toy Kola had fashioned from a bottle cap and string. The physical therapists watched with professional curiosity. The nurses logged the activity. Richard watched, and the intervals between his exhalations lengthened. Kola's movement did more than make Amanda's shoulders loosen. It changed the texture of their house. Where silence had once organized space, now there were punctuations, giggling, small conversations, the scratch of children's feet across a hallway. Even the staff moved, with a lightness that surprised them. The nanny began to hum while she made tea. The gardener whistled as he trimmed hedges according to lines that suddenly seemed less like prisons and more like borders to a place that could still be lived in. On rainy afternoons, Kola told small tales in the sitting room. He spoke of sleeping on the back of a bus when it grew too late to travel on. He told, in clipped sentences, about the corner by the laundromat where people left food in paper bags. He refused pity and did not beg for it. He described with a kind of pride the wooden bench where he had practiced his steps and the rhythm of the city that kept the beat in his bones. That the boy had lived hard did not mean he wanted to be pitied. He wanted to be seen. When Richard first sat down with Kola alone, he expected to reinforce boundaries. He had planned on offering a bag of food and a firm word that this could not become a permanent arrangement. Instead, he found himself listening. Kola answered questions plain and clean. He spoke of his mother with a tenderness that never turned into a sob story. He spoke of school books he sometimes used as cushions, of the smell of dust and clothes-lined water, of the clever ways he had learned to stand out so that a passerby might toss him a coin. He liked to dance. He liked to make people laugh. When Richard asked bluntly whether he wanted a more steady life, Kohler shrugged, as if the concept belonged to a map he did not own. "I'd like to sleep in a room," he said. "I'd like a pencil. Food and a blanket turned into hot dinners, and a corner with a thin mattress. A bag of clothes became a small wardrobe." On one quiet morning, Richard left a stack of books on Kohler's bed, an attempt at offering him schooling without the machinery of authority. Kohler opened them like a child cracking an egg. It was not grand charity. It was practical scaffolding. Richard watched the boy approach stability the way a careful investor watches a promising but volatile stock. Not all the household adjusted easily. There were whispers, neighbors who had always seen the mansion as an untouchable object, and now felt a small confusion at the sight of a ragged boy lingering by the gate. The press noticed too. Local papers ran pictures of the garden, the hashtag of kindness spread, and opinion split. Some praised the billionaire's newfound tenderness. Others wondered if this was another publicity play. But for Richard, these external murmurs were background noise. He was not thinking about the noise. He was listening to the small clinks of progress. The professionals remained measured. The pediatric physiotherapist, a woman with salt in her hair and steady hands, watched Amanda's sessions with careful curiosity. She would say, when asked, that motivation is meaningful and that there is no simple path from smile to standing. "Engagement," she said one afternoon, "opens doors that therapy can't pry alone. But you must remember, these are encouraging signs. They are not guarantees." That phrasing comforted and kept them honest. Richard loved clarity. He disliked false promises. Across weeks, Amanda's responses stitched together. A new habit, leaning toward a movement, peak of concentration, tiny raising of the torso, grew from repeated attempts. One afternoon, she managed a small, deliberate lift of her hips, almost a shrug against the chair, to reach for the small toy Kohler had made from bottle caps. The therapist clapped with contained delight. "This is progress," she said. "It's the first time she's initiated movement like that since the accident." The word initiated mattered. It shifted the axis of causality from passive treatment to active play. Kohler watched this with a look that tasted like pride. He did not claim credit as if he had performed a miracle. He smiled like a man who had been given a role in something larger than himself. Kohler's presence was not without its own disquiet. The city had taught him to keep a certain distance from those who looked too closely. He had learned early how to leave a scene before sympathy turned into expectation. Here, however, he found himself wanted, invited to stay. That invitation carried complications. Eyes from outside scanned for motive. The staff had to learn to balance openness with security. Richard had to decide how much of his life he was willing to loosen. The question was not whether to give money or room. It was whether to allow another person to shape the contours of his day. There came a morning when Richard crossed a line of his own making. He had taken to standing at the foot of Amanda's bed in the early hours, watching her sleep the way one watches borrowed art. On the day when the light was soft and the rain made the garden's greens smell like something cleansed, he found Kohler sitting at the foot of the wheelchair, conversing with Amanda in gestures and small noises. Kohler had picked up a pair of shoes and was tapping them like drums, inventing a story. Richard moved closer, and without rehearsing the words, offered Kohler the keys to a small storage cabinet where the house kept extra linens and out-of-season toys. "Take what you need," he said. "You can have a place here." The phrase felt enormous in his mouth, like a declaration that changed the shape of the household. Cola's eyes widened, as if the words had landed a small miracle. Only it wasn't miracle so much as an unbending choice. The city took notice. A local blogger called the arrangement a billionaire's benevolence. A tabloid ran a photo of the garden with a headline that split scorn and praise in equal parts. Critics asked whether Richard was performing for a camera. Admirers tweeted lines about the healing power of laughter. Richard read none of it in earnest. The only measurements that mattered were in the small increments a doctor charted, and in Amanda's growing willingness to try. The middle of the story arrived like a weather shift, not sudden, but undeniable. On a late afternoon, during one of the repeating rituals, Amanda sat in the wheelchair and watched Cola make a song out of the clink of spoons on a makeshift drum. He cued her. Reach for the spoon, now with your left hand, clap on the beat, lean forward just a little. The therapist, standing back, kept her voice soft. Don't rush her, she reminded. Just encourage. Amanda's arms trembled with the effort. She inhaled, small and steady, and lifted her torso, a movement that felt like a promise more than a fact. It was modest, the hips raising an inch, the spine leaning forward. But for those who had kept vigil, for Richard watching with a dryness at his jawline, it was monumental. The therapist's notebook closed and a smile softened her face. We've seen this before, she murmured. It's a sign of re-engagement. Keep building repetitions. Richard's hands, which had lately become more used to finding and arranging than to touching, found Amanda's in a small, unplanned gesture. He did not produce speeches or grand pronouncements. He said simply, "Good job." The words were small, and they landed like weights removed. Cola, who had thought himself a catalyst, felt the contour of responsibility deepen into tenderness. He began to attend more to the things Amanda liked when she could choose. He discovered that she favored the smell of orange peel and, at his expense, learned to mimic birds with a ridiculous tin whistle that always threatened to break. That he could give these small things mattered, because giving was not merely the transfer of objects, it was the translation of attention. Attention is its own kind of currency. The climb toward the climax was careful. It did not pretend to swoop past reality. Months stitched themselves into small proof. Amanda could transfer her hand to a nearby table. She could clap in rhythm. She could sit upright for longer stints. The therapists continued to counsel caution and tempered joy. The house, which had once been a shrine to order, became a place of repetitive exercises and silly interludes. There was choreography now, a schedule that had room for laughter. News of Amanda's progress slipped beyond the walls like a scent. A morning talk show invited a physiotherapist to comment on the power of motivation in child recovery. An op-ed wondered whether the spectacle of a billionaire's private grief had become a public lesson. Mouths would remark on Richard's choices. Some neighbors offered wary congratulations. Others still asked what motivated a man with unchecked means to disrupt his life for a dancing stranger. None of the chatter mattered to the child in the garden. The day came that had been rehearsed in tiny increments. It began like any other, the sun pouring between trimmed hedges, the boy on the lawn, the house holding its breath in polite readiness. The therapist was present, brace in hand, and the nanny had her face set with the determined optimism of someone who had learned to hope in small doses. Cola arrived at 4, as always. The household assembled not as an audience, so much as a cohort of people who had been transformed by a single small permission to allow joy back inside. They chose the spot by the arbor. Amanda sat with her feet in the wheelchair's stirrups, hands clenched on the armrests. Cola stood before her, as if setting an old play in motion, and began with familiar gestures to loosen the air. He clapped, he stamped, he coaxed. He set a count with his fingers, 1, 2, 3, and Amanda mirrored him, eyes bright with concentration and fear and a childish hope. This was the beat that had been practiced in pieces, Lean forward on 3. Push with your hips. Trust the hands that will hold you. The therapist checked straps, adjusted the brace at Amanda's knees, and watched the exchange like a person who had come to witness a rare kind of courage. Richard stood at one side, hands folded, every inch of his posture unclenched. In his chest there lived the strange, trembling thing that comes when a life pivots on a slender hinge. Kola took her hands, as he had done 1,000 small times before, and Richard positioned himself behind Amanda, on the other side. It was not dramatic in the way films script drama. It was the prosaic work of bodies understanding how to share weight. Kola and Richard, 2 people from opposite spectrums of life, established a triangle of trust with Amanda in the center. The world narrowed to breath, and the count they all followed. 1, Kola said softly. 2. The 3 of them leaned as if in remembering a dance that had once been possible. 3, they said together. Amanda pushed with a sound that was half gasp, half triumph. Her ankles, usually loose and unaccustomed, steadied just enough. For a brief, electric instant she stood. It was not graceful, it was not long. She stood like someone arriving on an unfamiliar shore, footing unsure, eyes wide. Her knees shook. Her fingers clung to Kola's and then to Richard's. There was no triumphant fanfare. There was only the small, perfect music of breath released, something in Richard unlatched. He had always been a man who believed in control. Now he let control become presence. Tears came slow and surprising, not the theatrical weeping of a conversion scene, but the tightly held thing that unspooled when the body gave way. He did not make a speech. He could not. He held Amanda, and she held him back. And Kola, who had never been accustomed to being part of a family, found himself one of the circle of arms. The therapists and staff cheered in low voices, more as witnesses than performers. The nanny laughed with a high note that broke the silence like wind. Amanda's laugh, this time longer and less startled, braided with the others. For a moment the world outside the hedges blurred into insignificance. Cameras, critics, opinions, all reduced by the simple fact of a child taking a step that had been a mountain for so long. But the story did not pretend that this one moment dissolved months of hardship. The therapist, gentle and precise, returned to the language that kept them honest. "This is a milestone," she said later, in the quiet of the clinic room where they took measurements and logged the oxygen of progress. "It's an encouraging sign. She'll need repetition, strength building, and time. But this is real. Motivation amplified what therapy started." Richard wrote checks, practical, not performative. He hired more therapists, not to parade them, but to build consistency into Amanda's schedule. He arranged transportation to appointments and set up a little corner of the house as a dedicated practice space. He bought a set of small weights and a harness that allowed safe attempts at standing. He did not promise cures, he promised presence. For once, presence mattered more than the transaction. Media attention swelled and then split. Pictures of the garden made for glossy spreads. Pundits debated motive like economists arguing margin. There were detractors, of course, those who said a man in Richard's position sought redemption in public acts. There were defenders who saw only the human thing that had happened in a backyard. The staff learned to deflect questions with polite statements. "We are focused on Amanda's therapy and a child's well-being." Newspapers printed lines about compassion and cynicism in equal measure. The noise was a reminder that the world loved to turn every tender choice into an argument. But the truth of the house was quieter. There came a conversation between Richard and Kola where the big decisions were made small. They sat in the kitchen after dinner, hands sticky from the orange cake the nanny improvised to celebrate the standing, and Kola fiddled with a worn pencil. Richard, who had always chosen words carefully, surprised himself. "I'm offering you a room," he said. "A proper bed, meals, school. Not as an investor, as a choice. No cameras, no fanfare, just stay if you want." Kola licked the frosting off his fingers and looked at the man who had everything. The boy had known gestures of generosity before. Coins thrown from the window, paper cups of soup. This was different. It offered continuity. He said simply, "I want to learn. I want to sleep in a bed." The request was small and precise, like a blueprint for a life he had not been able to imagine. Richard made arrangements not because of headlines, but because the house had become a place that could hold more than grief. He bought school books and a backpack. He found, in the city's public system, a place where Kola could attend classes part-time. He hired a tutor. He did not insist on legal forms to make Kola a son on paper. He offered a place at his table and the dignity of being invited. The press called it an adoption in their headlines, then corrected themselves when asked for specifics. The household, however, did not live by headlines. They lived by dinners, by the timing of visits, by the way laughter threaded itself into daily life. Time did not transform Amanda overnight. She continued therapy. Some days she regressed slightly, tired from progress. There were frustrations. She would sometimes flinch at noises. She would tire quickly. But steady work and the elastic of consistent affection tightened things into habit. Kola learned to be patient. Richard learned to be present without dictatorial management. The nanny taught Kola how to fold shirts. The gardener showed him how to plant bulbs that would bloom in spring. Richard found in these exchanges that to be wealthy was not merely to own things, but to distribute them in ways that required humility. One had to learn how to be given to. Outside the hedges, the city did what cities do. Its attention moved on. The tabloids wrote follow-ups, and then, eventually, new stories replaced the old. Neighbors who had been skeptical stopped appearing in gossip columns, and instead found themselves invited to holiday dinners. The controversy faded into an everyday rhythm that looked from the inside like healing. The household acquired small, ordinary rituals. Saturday mornings belonged to cartoons, and eggs scrambled loud in the kitchen. Kola liked the way sunlight hit the table when he sat at the window to do his homework. Amanda liked to press her hands to the cool glass and imagine the park beyond. Richard began to join them, not as an overseer, but as a parent who could sit and be silly, awkwardly pulling faces to get a smile, or learning games where he inevitably failed and laughed at himself. There were evenings when he would find himself reading aloud, his baritone voice smoothing the day like a blanket. He had wealth, yes, but he had gained something harder, a capacity to be vulnerable in front of others. Once in late autumn, Amanda walked with support across the drawing-room carpet, her steps small and determined. Kola clapped each time she advanced another inch. Richard watched and felt a kind of redemption that had nothing to do with the public ledger and everything to do with the small arithmetic of human presence. He had believed that he could purchase recovery with the right treatments, the right practitioners, the right equipment. He learned instead that the surest aids were not a ledger entry, but a chorus of small, persistent commitments. A boy dancing at 4 each afternoon, meals served by hands that cared, a man willing to change his life for someone else's laugh. At night, the garden became their sacred ordinary stage. They would sit on the tiled patio with cups of tea and the low murmur of nocturnal city life far beyond the hedges. Amanda would sometimes hum along to a tune Kola composed on his tin whistle, and Richard would listen until sleep took the child's chest in its easy hold. In those moments he felt wealthy in a way he had not thought possible, not because of money in a bank, but because his household demonstrated a truth he had been slow to learn. Belonging was measurable in the length of a laugh and the ease of a hand offered without calculation. The public's attention dwindled into a memory of headlines. Some commentators wrote that the story had been an attempt at redemption. Others said it was a silver lining. For the Lawson household, the debate had the distant tone of a radio. They noticed it, but it did not shape the path forward. Richard's decision to bring Cola into the home stood not as a performance, but as a practice of becoming less alone. Years later, when someone asked Richard what had changed, he would not frame his answer in terms of philanthropic gesture. He would say something simpler and quieter. "I used to think wealth meant never needing anyone. Now I know it means being able to give someone a place to belong." The phrasing sat honest in his mouth because it did not erase what he had lost. It added to what he had gained. Amanda's recovery continued to be a tapestry of small threads, therapies, setbacks, triumphs, days of stubborn pain. She never became the version of the child she would have been without trauma in a single cinematic jump. But the laughter she reclaimed, piece by piece, taught her household how to be alive again. Cola grew from a boy living inch by inch to one, with a corner of his own, books that smelled of glue and paper, and a bruise of confidence that bloomed like the bulbs the gardener had planted. He stopped slipping through hedges because he did not need to. He arrived through the gate because it was his gate, and then entered the house because it was his home. On a late spring afternoon, the three of them, Richard, Amanda, and Cola, sat on the garden steps as the sun went gold over trimmed hedges. The house hummed behind them, a place that no longer tried to be immaculate at the cost of living. Amanda held Cola's hand. Richard's thumb caught the space between them and moved in slow, parenthesis-like circles. They did not need to speak. Laughter had become their kind of language, but so had silence. Silence here was not an absence of sound, but the presence of peace. Across the city, the story lingered in the memory of those who had watched it bloom. A boy who danced for a stranger, a father who changed his life for his daughter, a child who, in finding her laughter, recovered part of how to be a child again. For Richard, the measure of the change was not in how many people read about his choice, but in the quiet adjustments he made. Fewer meetings, more dinners at the table, doors open to those who needed a place, not to the cameras. He kept some habits: a reserved seat at Amanda's therapy, a small pile of Cola's schoolwork on his desk, because the lessons of living together required daily practice. There were still critics who would say that rich men can only change the world through spectacle. There were others who believed that a single act of kindness could not unmake systemic inequality. Both points existed like competing notes in a longer chorus. The Lawson household made no claims to have fixed anything grander than their own lives. They had, by the simple insistence of making room for a child who danced, shifted the center of one house, and in doing so, altered the orbit of three people. The night settled, and the three silhouettes remained on the steps, framed by the warm wash of a porch light. They were ordinary and miraculous at once. Not miraculous in the sense of instant cures, but miraculous in the discipline of attentiveness. The mansion no longer felt like armor. It had become a home that wore your fingerprints. A barefoot boy who had once slipped through a hedge now left prints across the kitchen floor. A father who had been wealthy in all the wrong ways now kept his fortune as a means to shelter a child's growth. A little girl found a rhythm again, imperfect but hers. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the quiet power of small, stubborn kindnesses, share it with someone who needs to hear that laughter can be found in unexpected places. Stories like this do not rewrite the world in a day, but they remind us of what steering toward another person can do. Months later, the final image that lingered was simple: three figures in the garden, the night softening their edges. Amanda's laugh chimed, now fuller and seasoned with practice. Cola tapped his foot to a rhythm that had once been all he owned. Richard sat between them, his hands no longer only for signing documents, but for cradling fragile, living things. The lights in the house glowed like a promise, not of perfection, but of continuity. In the hush, after a long day, the mansion's marble reflected a life that had learned to measure wealth not by columns of numbers, but by the length of an evening, and the fact that, for the first time in a long time, a little girl could stand, briefly, then more and more, and laugh with her father and with a boy who had come through a hedge with nothing but his feet and a heart full of rhythm.